Hi, this is Zibby Owens, and you're listening to Totally Booked with Zibby, formerly Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. In my daily show, I interview today's latest best-selling, buzziest, or underrated authors and story creators whose work I think is worth your time. As a bookstore owner, publisher, author, and obviously podcaster, I get a comprehensive look at everything that's coming out and spend my time curating the best books so you don't have to. Stay in the know, get insider insights, and connect with guests like I do every single day. For more information, go to zibbymedia.com and follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens. Beth Macy is the author of Paper Girl, a memoir of home and family in a fractured America. Beth has won more than 24 National Journalism Awards, including a Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard University, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Dopesick, which was made into a Peabody Award-winning series for Hulu. 3 of her books have been New York Times bestsellers. She lives in Roanoke, Virginia. Welcome, Beth. Thank you so much for coming on Totally Booked to talk about Paper Girl, a memoir of hope and family in a fractured America. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Zibby. It's an honor to be here.
Oh my gosh. Can you tell listeners what your book is about?
Sure. This book grew out of an op-ed piece I wrote for the New York Times in 2020. It was right after the election, and I couldn't figure out what was happening to my hometown and my family. My mother was dying. She was in her 90s and had had a stroke. And it happened to be the Saturday after the 2020 election. And she was literally breathing like her last breaths. And the hospice nurse said, "Oh, they called it for Biden." And my sister, who was evangelical and had long been, but had never really been political before, said, "You wait, it's fraudulent. He won't win." And Mom is going, and I just thought, what the heck has happened? And so I grew up in this small town in Western Ohio. It was a place that had been a celebrated stop on the Underground Railroad. And when I had noticed as I was going home more, as my mom was sick, I live in Virginia, is there were now Confederate flags dotting the streets. And my relatives and I no longer agreed on basic facts, even the weather and what was causing all the storms. So I thought, after I wrote this piece in the Times, and I got so much feedback in like 1 hour, I thought, wow, I'm not the only one going through this. And it turns out 20% of Americans are estranged from family members because of politics. And we weren't exactly estranged, but I decided to, for 2 years, I went home. I spent about a week every month embedding in my hometown, which I hadn't lived in 40 years. To find out what was left of the people I loved, who raised me, and what, if anything, was left of my family.
Wow. Well, the way you tell the story, sort of weaving in your own experiences and the experiences of people in the town, paints a portrait of a town not just affected by politics, but just so much strife, so much bad luck, such a lack of opportunity for the people there, and sort of the whole class of people who can no longer find their way. And you show us example after example of this, and you show, a lot about your own family and your parents and all of that, which let us see who you are as a person, which I also found fascinating. And then to see you digging deep into what happened since, I found absolutely, absolutely fascinating and eye-opening about what, as you said, is happening in so many places. So
yeah, I mean, I think we all live in bubbles, no matter what our bubble is, pretty much everybody. And so it was, quite frankly, even though I was always in touch with my relatives, it was a shock.
Mm-hmm.
It was a shock to me that graduation rates had plummeted in 10 years, that the number of kids in foster care had tripled. These are things you would never know if you were driving through this town, which just won some best hometown in Ohio award. It looks like Mayberry on the surface, and it's got some cool stuff going on, some new stuff. But, a block or two from the town square, you see the underbelly playing out. And the thing that, the reason why I was so it felt so urgent to me is because I had once delivered that paper. I had written for papers. I wrote for papers for almost 30 years, including the paper I delivered when I was little. That was one of my college internship jobs. And it's still there, but it's like owned by a hedge fund, and there are basically 1.5 reporters. They can't even cover city council anymore. So all the stuff I was finding out on my research, I was telling other people, and they didn't really know. I mean, some did. The teachers know what's going on. The guy who runs the youth center knows what's going on. The police chief, who has watched emergency mental health calls increase by a factor of 9 in 40 years, he knows what's going on. But as someone near the end of the book says, in Urbana, it's the country club set and the ghetto set, and with the demise of the middle class, these two sets have no idea what's going on with each other. So the whole exercise was really eye-opening, and there were some hopeful parts, but it was also a mixed bag.
And so after this whole experience and having written the book, like, what next? Like, what can we do before more towns keep sliding? I mean, your example of the paper, I know you mentioned that, the paper became like a couple Instagram posts and some press releases, and like, where is the news? How do people record that people were watching hours of, what was going on in Russia and developing all these fake ideas, and yet they don't know what's going on a mile from their house? Like, how do we combat things like that? What do we do about it?
Yeah, well, I think we all have to get active in our own communities right now. I have gotten much more politically active since I finished writing this. I think we have to make alliances, and we need to start running Better People for Office. We need to support what little local media we have. We need to, one of the reasons we need better people running things is because we need to shore up our public education system, which is so under attack these days with all these private school vouchers. And, in my hometown, as the middle class thinned out, the middle class families who were still there, they were witnessing the decline. They start sending their kid to an adjacent school district, and then that money goes with them to this more rural farmland, not so distressed. And when that money goes with them, it just hurts everybody that's left behind. And the same with the private school. The real shocker was just every single factory owner I talked to was hard up for employees, and we're having just terrible attendance issues. And in the school, there was a parallel flood of people showing up as well. So, we know that attendance went down during COVID, but in the places least likely to really go out there and do some of the programs I write about, the good examples happening elsewhere, they just don't have the funding for stuff like that. So it's the same kids not showing up for school are the kids of parents who aren't showing up for work. And I was shocked when that Springfield story with the Haitian migrants blew up. That's like 20 minutes away from Urbana. And I had been interviewing my ex-boyfriend, who I hadn't seen in 38 years. And I knew he had gone from being extremely liberal, Bernie Sanders, to, holy cow, a total 180, deep into QAnon and other conspiracies, and watching 4 to 7 hours of Russian propaganda every day. And then suddenly, I felt like I was in the Forrest Gump movie. He emerges as the leader of the anti-Haitian pushback in Springfield. And there he is on PBS NewsHour and all these other shows. And, at that point, he had gotten so almost verbally abusive to me that I cut off contact. And, a cop buddy of mine said, "You need to carry a gun." I'm not totally anti-gun. I think there need to be serious restrictions, but I've never owned one. And it was just like, wow, are we really at this verge of being in a civil war? It really shook me.
Wow. My gosh. How do you then go back to your life in Virginia after how are you doing that emotionally? The shifting back and forth, uncovering and writing and trying to process something that shifted quietly and in a
Yeah,
deadly way, right under our noses, right?
I know. Well, one of the things I've done, and I'll admit I started doing it just as a way to promote that the book was coming out. I've also always had author newsletters I did with Dope Sick and going back to Factory Man, where I would tell people it was mostly about my stuff. And then I was like, the local media here where I live in a, moderate sized city, it's about an urban area of about 300,000. We also have experienced the same decline in news. So I started using my Substack as a way to tell stories of how the the new Trump administration's cuts and policy choices were impacting real people on the ground here. And that's been, I mean, it's really fun. I'm basically a paper girl at heart. I'm still a reporter. Right? And so, like today, I just published a Substack about, it was an update on this woman I had written about in 2014 who, when she got out of prison, heroin, drug related crime, she was able to be hired by this nail salon that was only hiring felons as a way to help them re-enter the workforce. And when I first wrote about her, like she was a huge success, but in her goal of goals, she always wanted to be a nurse. And the salon owner took her under her wing. One of her patrons happened to be the hospital CEO and encouraged her to go into nursing. And she did with a lot of help. And I was on vacation recently and I got an all caps email from her 11 years later. And on her third try at nursing school, all caps, I am a nurse, exclamation
Oh.
point. So like, and you see I mean, that's what I think we fall for the easy story. But I know I learn best through a person. And when you can see a woman like Ebony, that's her name, like she had to rely on Medicaid, she had to rely on SNAP. Both of those programs are being cut. She's now she works for a rehab, a drug rehab center, and she helps people in recovery, some of whom are also coming out of jail. But that rehab is paid for because of the Medicaid expansion in Virginia, and which was a huge portal for particularly men who we know die at a rate of 2 to 3 times more than women with substance use disorders die. That was really, Medicaid has become their lifeline. And a lot of people who are more experts than I believe that these Medicaid cuts are really going to set us back 30 years on the opioid crisis. So I'm just learning how to connect the dots because I'm not to disparage my media colleagues. There just aren't enough of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been really eye-opening and interesting too. And then I've also just become like, I go to these rallies every Monday at noon. A bunch of people meet outside of our no-show congressman's office asking for a town hall. We've done it every single week since President's Day in February, asking for a town hall and trying to get him to explain his support for these policies.
And you also write about yourself that you were a beneficiary of a Pell Grant when you were trying to get yourself out and into the world and into college and all these things that you had aspired for, and that those programs are being cut as well, right? If I got that correct.
Yeah, and that's something you wouldn't notice unless it was on your radar. I didn't notice it until I started teaching at our local community college. And I realized there was this huge stigma against Pell Grant holders. And I'm like, wait, guys, I was a Pell Grant holder. Now, when I went to college, I went to a 4-year state school in Ohio. We were so poor that I got a full Pell Grant and it paid for everything. College was like $2,300 a year, right? It wasn't a lot, but it paid 100%. Now, if you're as poor per capita as I was, a Pell Grant is only going to pay for 30%. So me, born 15 years later, would not have been able to go to college, which would have been awful for me. I say going to college saved my life. But also, if you think about it, it's not fiscally sound. I have more than paid back 100 times over anything I got from a grant with my taxes because I've earned so much more money and have been able to have a family and a very stable middle class life that otherwise had never been available to me before. And, I get asked to give graduation speeches a lot. And I always tell the story of feeling like a food stamp recipient in line at a Whole Foods the first time I showed up at my cost cutter college, because everybody had beer and pizza money. I had to have 3 jobs, which was fine, but it just opened me up in so many ways that people who don't get that experience not only don't get to see that, but they don't get the opportunity to give back and do meaningful work that helps their communities. Not everyone, but by and large, particularly since the dumping of opioids in these very same communities where the factory jobs went away. I mean, I write about that a lot in Dope Sick, and then in the follow-up book, in the communities where the jobs went away, in particular, the same communities the big pharma companies targeted, because there were lots of people on Medicaid, people with workplace injuries, legitimate injuries, who needed meds. And then they did their pitch saying that this drug is non-addictive. And so you saw that playing out in Urbana, as well as Appalachia, and in cities and towns all over America. But I was so busy raising my kids and having a career, it didn't really occur to me what had happened with the Pell Grant. And it got virtually zero press, because who would be the lobbyist that would stand up for that? Like, there were a few, but not many. And so that was a really interesting thing. I had this hunch that had happened, but really to go out and report it and see the figures, it was astonishing. And, it goes back to Reagan's Secretary of Education, called the idea that education, LBJ said, the secret to every problem of the world is education, and that's like profoundly moving to me, because it was for me. But Reagan comes along in the 80s and appoints, starts the first real cuts of these programs. And as Secretary of Education, William Bennett says the idea that if a poor kid goes to college, and that's going to help America, is sociological flimflammery. And I mean, we were just sold a bill of goods about that. And it's that same thread that you're seeing coming out now in Project 2025 and the dissolution of the Department of Ed that's coming. And just one more story, if I may. I knew that when I started going back, because I learned through people better than I learned through studies and academics, I wanted to pick a young me. So I went all over town asking teachers, counselors, because I was a good student. I wasn't like top of the class, but I was in the top 15. Who was a promising poor kid? And everybody pointed to the same kid. And he happened to be the student director of the band, the drum major. And I was the president of the band. So the same Urbana Hill Climbers marching band, only the band is now a quarter the size. We used to spell out the word hill climber in the field with our bodies. Now they can barely spell out the word Ohio. And Silas, I watched him at graduation. He gets a full scholarship to a nearby community college, but it's rural, so it's an hour away. And that full scholarship isn't going to pay for him to have reliable transportation. So I watch him go through a series of 5 clunker cars, something like 4 different jobs, just during this 10-month certificate program to become a welder. And the difference in us, because I would go back to these teachers and I would report what I was seeing, what was happening with Silas, and so much family drama. Dad overdosed and died. Mom is in and out of prison. He was homeless junior and senior years of high school. I mean, so much. My trauma would fit on Silas's pinky. He has so much more trauma than I have. But when I would go back to report that to the people who suggested he's the one I profiled, they would say, yeah, that's the new Beth Macy. And that was like, oh, that just got me. Because he is. He's gutsier and grittier and smarter than I was. And hats off to him. And he's now raising his 2 younger siblings. He just turned 20.
Oh my gosh. Well, I appreciate you introducing us to Silas in the book and all of breaking it down the way you described it now, but really in detail in the book of this is why this is not going to work out for him. These are the obstacles people don't think about. This is what's getting in the way. It's not enough to give a scholarship, even if you're lucky enough, and just really spelling it out for people who haven't thought a lot about the ins and outs and what that means, and therefore how change can happen as a result is really important.
And also, it's also an explanation for why we're so divided too. So like, I'm certainly not the only one that has a hard time talking to her sister about politics. I mean, we don't even talk about it, like, period, anymore. But we have to find a way to have a common language again. Our trust is so broken down now.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you do that other than having conversations, getting really active in your local communities, and rebuilding up networks that can help build back trust in community.
I did say the same thing, by the way, to my husband the other day. I was like, I feel like we are going to have a civil war. Like, where else is this leading? Like, everything is so divided. I feel like this is actually in the cards. And anyway, the fact that
every day there's a new fresh hell about it. Yeah, like the gerrymandering in Texas. So they flee, and then the people in California are going to do the same thing. And it's like, somebody in my book says, we're going to end up in little districts all clustered with like-minded people, like in the Hunger Games. I think of that almost every time I read the news.
Oh my gosh. Great. Well, this is depressing. Thanks for sharing.
Like, I wish I would have. So much for a happy day I was having. But
now it's time for ice cream.
There is hope. There are people like that I reconnected with. And, one of my best friends, I've known her since I was 4. She's a business leader in the town. She read an early copy and she said, I think I'm going to change my media diet. It's like, wow, Betty, good on you.
Yeah.
And some people aren't going to like it. And, if it gets a few people to just go beyond that simple story that we have been fed in order to make corporations and wealthy people wealthier, that's all I can ask for.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Totally Booked with Zibby, formerly Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you loved the show, tell a friend, leave a review, follow me on Instagram @ZibbyOwens, and spread the word. Thanks so much. Oh, and buy the books.